recording will be available for us to use in Australia, but also at the request of the International Peace Bureau for their collection of their sessions, the total collection, which you'll be able to access after they get organised when the Congress is over. I'm going to introduce Dr. Lisa Natividad first. Lisa's an old friend, really, of the peace movement in Australia. She's been here in a couple of, or more than a couple of times to speak at conferences, and she's a wonderful friend as a result of those times that she's spent here. So Lisa's a professor of social work at the University of Guam, and she's also the primary convener of the Guam Coalition for Peace and Justice. She's an Indigenous Chamorro person who has championed the exposure of human rights violations against her people and the homeland of Guam, which is a military colony of the United States. She's spoken globally on the topics of demilitarization, decolonization, and the critical role that women play in the creation of a safe and secure future. Dr. Natividad has presented interventions on the halting of the massive military build-up in Guam before the United Nations Fourth Committee, Decolonization Committee, and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Welcome, Lisa, and Lisa will be sharing her slides on this Zoom. We enabled today.
Thank you, Annette, and thank you, IPAN. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces and friends, clearly friends. I just want to say a special shout out to Hannah, who began my engagement with Australia many years ago, and we've certainly appreciated the relationship over time. Can I ask, Annette, for you to allow or enable the screen share? You're muted. Okay, there we go. Now I see it. Now I see it. Okay. Give me 1 second because it's in a format that's different than what I'm used to using. So take me a little bit of time. Okay. Yeah, because my other screen keeps disappearing. My Zoom screen keeps disappearing every time I pull up the video screen. So you've disappeared. So give me a second so I can press the screen share button. Sorry. Okay, there you are. Okay, let me do this screen. I gotta do this simultaneously. Oh gosh. Okay. Sorry. 1 second here.
No worries, Lisa, you just work away at it.
The pane keeps disappearing before I can press the screen share button because this is on a QuickTime player file. Let me start this and then I'll rewind it and then go back. Okay, so just bear with me for a sec. I knew I should have tested this earlier. Okay, we know that's working. So let me get the Zoom screen back up. Okay. Okay, there we are. This should work now. Okay, here we go.
Buenas Tanhafade, I'm Lisa Natividad from the University of Guam and the Guam Coalition for Peace and Justice. And I'll be talking today about the people movements, the building of a peace movement across the Pacific, and focusing on demilitarization and climate change. And so where are we? I share this slide so that the world can appreciate the vastness that is the Pacific Ocean and the Pacific peoples. So as you can see, the Pacific spans as far down to the south as New Zealand and Australia in this sort of quadrant, and as far north, all the way up by here with the Northern Mariana Islands. And we are in the North Pacific, as well as with Hawaii, the Marshall Islands, and as far to the west as way over here to Pitcairn Island. So we are albeit filled with water in the vast Pacific Ocean, which we refer to as Moana Nui, we also are a very big expanse of space. And to help us appreciate what this expanse of space looks like, one of the three subregions of the Pacific, which is Micronesia. So there's Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. And just Micronesia alone is equivalent to roughly the size of the continental United States. As you can see with this map here that superimposes the US map, continental map on top of Micronesia. And so you can get an idea of the expansive space that we're talking about. And throughout Oceania, we have diverse histories, diverse cultures, and political statuses as well. And so as we look at the impact of militarization in the Pacific, there's a lot of different things that we experience from the coexistence with militarization. And so the first I mentioned is societal unrest and instability. And this really is largely from the context of domestic militarization, which oftentimes is the case in our small island developing states, as well as land dispossession. And land dispossession oftentimes occurs with the taking of traditional ancestral lands for the purposes of military bases, particularly in the case of the North Pacific, as in my home island of Guahan, wherein the US has occupied about 1/3 of our island since, certainly since post-World War II, but about 1/3 of the island, even stemming back to after the Spanish-American War. We are a region that knows radiation exposure very well, particularly with nuclear testing that has occurred in various countries in the Pacific that include the Republic of the Marshall Islands, probably most popularly, as well as in Australia, in Kiribati, and in Maui Nui or French Polynesia. And with radiation exposure, as with other military activities, also comes environmental devastation and toxic contamination. Most recently, or more recently to the surface in terms of making connections, is the impacts of militarization on climate change. And in this slide is an image of Kiribati during big tide, wherein tides come in, and as you can see, it literally floods the waters, flood communities, flood homelands, and floods the entire islands and low-lying atolls. Where there is toxicity and radiation, there's going to be poor health outcomes. And oftentimes in the case of cancer, and with exposure to radiation, particularly thyroid cancer, as well as death from wars, right? As in the case of my home island, we have very high enlistment rates in the US Department of Defense. Another impact of militarization is the prohibition of traditional practices. In our case on Guahan, there's limited access to fishing, traditional fishing grounds, and this is because of the land takings for bases, which of course oftentimes bump up against the ocean, as well as the inability to access traditional medicinal plants that grow primarily behind military fences. And ultimately, as part of militarization, is the deferment of the right to self-determination and self-governance in occupied lands and territories. And so I wanted to zone into, as a case example, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which is politically a free association of and with the United States that was established in 1986. And so as you can see from this slide, the Marshall Islands is a cluster, a collection of different atolls. And you can appreciate how many islands and how much the vast expanse of ocean connects all that comprises what we refer to as the Marshall Islands. And so at the center, we have Quadrillion Atoll. We have Enewetak over here to the left, which is part of what was heavily bombed during the nuclear test. Here we have Bikini Atoll as well as Romelap. These three are most noted in terms of atomic testing. In the Marshall Islands is the Quadrillion Atoll Reagan Test Site, also referred to as the Quadrillion Missile Range. It hosts about 3,000 people, mostly US military personnel. And you have the image of Quadrillion Island here. And there are Marshallese people present on Quadrillion, however, they are only there with permission. And in terms of defining what happens on Quadrillion Island, quote, radar, optical, and telemetry sensors are operated at the US Army's Reagan Test Site, RTS, to support missile testing, space surveillance operations, and science experiments for DoD, DOE, and NASA. And so in order to develop Quadrillion Island, the natives of the island had to be relocated. And so they were relocated to Reimagine Atoll, which has been described as, quote, one of the most crowded islands on Earth. For 0.14 square miles, there's about 15,000 people. And so I'll just go back to the previous slide so you can contrast what the living environment and conditions for the Marshallese people is here, in contrast to Quadrillion, where you see airstrip, much more organization, much more green space, and really in so many ways, the typical sort of layout of a US military base. And so most of us in the peace movement are familiar with this image. This is a picture of the detonation of Bravo tests, which was America's first hydrogen bomb that was tested in Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And we know from this experience that the Marshallese people were treated as human radiation experiments. And so in this picture, we see the photos that were taken, numbers that were assigned, dates that were given while they studied the impact of radiation on humanity. And switching gears a little bit, I mentioned earlier about the high enlistment rates. And with high enlistment rates comes high mortality. And so I wanted to share a quote from the Washington Post of a reporter that did a story on my home island of Guahan, and he described, and I'll quote here, people here grow up with war ringing in their ears as described by their grandparents. So in many of our home islands, as in the case of the Marshall Islands and Guahan, we're heavily militarized communities. And so you can see here, this slide in terms of looking at lives lost, you'll see that our rate is of 5.8 people per 100,000 inhabitants that have died. This is the mortality incidence of our people who have died in military wars, in contrast to the US's rate, which is only 1.44, and to other states that are either higher or lower than that. So we are dying at a much higher rates compared to your average quote-unquote American. And so what have we in the Pacific done to respond to nuclear tests, to the nuclear presence, to militarization in our region, and to colonization? And so one of our biggest responses has been that what's referred to as the NFIP movement, which stands for the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement. This movement was established in 1975 in the country of Fiji. They are a nonprofit organization that's relatively loosely organized. They had their own secretariat office that was called the Pacific Concerns Resource Center. And they coordinated conferences after 75 and 78, 1980, and 1983 in different Pacific countries. Most notably, however, is that they adopted the People's Charter for a Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific. And part of their influence has resulted in nuclear-free constitutions in 3 countries in the Pacific, namely the Republic of Palau, also popularly known as Palau, as well as Vanuatu, and the
Sorry, Lisa, I accidentally muted you. Can you unmute yourself?
I know I would have muted myself earlier, but then you wouldn't be able to hear it. So. Okay, shall I play it?
However, that clause of their constitution was repealed in 1993 after 11 plebiscites. And that was due to the United States' Compact of Free Association requirement for the operation of nuclear propelled vessels and to be able to store nuclear weapons in Palau. This created great unrest, and it was largely the women who led the advocacy efforts to protect their nuclear-free constitution, which required and ultimately resulted in 11 plebiscites before it was overturned. As a matter of fact, one of the things that occurred in Palau was the assassination of President Lazarus Salih, who maintained the position that, quote unquote, we have no enemies. So by extension, then, it was illogical that they should have nuclear weapons in their home islands. Palau more recently is known in 2009 for its asylum of Guantanamo prisoners, 17 of them. And more recently, even more recently, former President Fernandes and the current president, Whips Jr., have offered and have worked closely with the United States and have offered to build a base to counter China in their own homelands. And so NFAP was able to adopt the People's Charter for a Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific. And I just wanted to share the part of the preamble that's really reflective of the empowerment of small Pacific Island states and taking control of their region, claiming the role of protecting what is. And so the preamble there states, and I quote, "We note in particular the recent racist roots of the world's nuclear powers, and we call for an immediate end to the oppression, exploitation, and subordination of the indigenous people of the Pacific. We, the people of the Pacific, will assert ourselves and wrest control over the destiny of our nations and our environment from foreign powers, including the transnational corporations." And so this gleans to the tension that exists between small island Pacific states and the larger states, even within the context of the Pacific, such as Australia, from time to time, New Zealand, certainly the United States and others. So part and parcel to the NFIP movement was the Pacific Islands Forum and continues to exist today. The Pacific Islands Forum, referred to as the PIF, adopted at their 16th meeting held in Rarotonga in the Cook Islands, the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone Treaty. Please note that it is the nuclear-free zone, not nuclear weapons-free zone, because it extended beyond just addressing issues of nuclear weapons to include all things nuclear. And so this treaty specifically indicated no manufacturing or possession of nuclear weapons, no atomic testing, and no radioactive waste or matter in Pacific. The countries that signed on to this treaty included Australia and a number of other Pacific Island states. About 12 countries were signatories to this treaty. And it's noteworthy to mention that to date, the US hasn't ratified this treaty. Also absent from the countries in terms of the signing were the US affiliated Pacific Island jurisdictions. And so the PIF, or the Pacific Island Forum, in 2019 convened a leaders meeting in which there was a mandate to carry out the provisions of the Treaty of Rarotonga. And a year later, in December of 2020, the first state parties meeting to commemorate the 35-year anniversary of the adoption of the treaty was held. And during that meeting, they created a nuclear legacies task force to assist nuclear survivors in both the Marshall Islands and in Kiribati. So when we look at Pacific movements over time, we see exciting things that happened with the NFIP movement, as well as with the past and ongoing work of the Pacific Islands Forum. In more recent times, we've had the formation of the Pacific Peace Network. This kind of came to mind and formulated in 2019 at one of the IPAN conferences, largely organized by the leaders of IPAN, which is the Independent Peaceful Australia Network. And so since 2019, there have been 2 events that have been hosted by the Pacific Peace Network, the first of which was a Cancel REMPAC event specific to military exercises that are carried out in the waters of Hawaii, which is not currently a state of the US, as well as more recently the Cancel Taliman Sabre event, which was held just in the past year. In addition, the Pacific is now seeing an organizing of Pacific Indigenous women's women in a network called the Pacific Indigenous Women's Network. This is largely organized by women in the North Pacific and is currently in its infancy stage and is reaching out for funding sources to expand and connect with sisters throughout the Pacific region, particularly hoping to organize women at the 3 different sub-regional levels of the Pacific. And then we also have the Pacific Network on Globalization, also referred to as PANG, who's done amazing work when it comes to topics of climate change, as well as deep sea mining. And most recently, in the last few months, we've seen a huge protest in Maui Nui, or French Polynesia, a protest rally that was calling out France's, quote, crime against humanity. And we have a photo of that here. And they were able to turn out 2,000 people for this, as Maui Nui, while an entity on the UN's list of non-self-governing territories, has certainly, through the leadership of past President Oscar Temaru, has been very active in terms of pushing the agenda of justice around atomic survivors and nuclear testing. So more specifically, when we look at militarism and climate change, we see and we know that the US military and other militaries throughout the world are one of the worst environmental polluters. They are certainly the biggest producer of GHG emissions, highest consumer of fossil fuels. This oftentimes happens because whenever there's war preparation or invasion or any kind of entering into a country or a sovereign space to set up their military operations, they often are set up in very remote spaces. And in doing so, the importation of gas to those locations and transferring the gas from the urban centers to the remote sites is a very costly endeavor and requires lots of fossil fuel. They also are the highest toxic waste polluters, as you can imagine, with war preparation, as in the case of atomic testing and so forth. They have the highest demand of resources to develop their infrastructure. They're heavily funded in the US context. They comprise about 60% of the US's discretionary budget to fund militarism. And in a way that's very unjust, they are exempted from environmental restrictions, emission measurements, and climate agreements as sort of carte blanche as military enterprise. They are very much embedded in a cycle of destruction, as is war is about, or militarism is about war preparation and war execution. And the military spending takes resources away from climate mitigation and adaptation efforts, as well as other social programs that really help to build true and genuine security, right? Such as programs in education, particularly now with the need for healthcare that is exacerbated with the COVID-19 response. And other things that really help to make us feel safe in our communities. And lastly, it places the high burden on Indigenous small island communities, as we saw in the Marshall Islands, as we see in my hyper-militarized island, home island of Guahan, and as we see throughout the Pacific. But it's important to note that the Pacific is fighting back in terms of climate change. And as this photo here says, we are not drowning, we are fighting. You know, this is a photo of the Pacific warriors against climate change, right? And so we certainly have been at the forefront of these efforts. And so I wanted to just take some time to give a shout out to some Pacific climate justice activists who are mostly from small islands, low-lying atolls in the Pacific. To the left here, we have Ana Nuariki from Kiribati, who has been a strong advocate, particularly focused in centering her endeavors on the different COP processes from Kiribati. And she is working largely with protecting the outer islands of Kiribati that are at very high risk for rising sea levels as a result of climate change. Then at the center here, we have Kathy Jetno-Kilgener from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, who is increasingly becoming a climate celebrity, having addressed the UN General Assembly in New York and delivering a very powerful poem that was responded to with a standing ovation. And then lastly, we have Ursula Rakova from Papua New Guinea, whose peoples in the outer islands of PNG stand and are anticipated and projected to be the first of the necessary climate migrants as a result of climate change. But I want to underscore what I put here at the top, and that is that in the Pacific, we are the least contributors to climate change, and we are the ones paying the biggest price. And when I say the least contributors to climate change, what I mean is that in our small Pacific communities, our consumption of fossil fuels and other things that increases the risk of climate change is something that we contribute very minusculely to. Yet, we pay the biggest price of having to leave our homelands because of and climate displacement, essentially, because of rising sea, as well as the inability of our lands to sustain life as a result of salination and so forth. And so shifting our gears a little bit and looking at what's happened most notably in the Pacific in the last few weeks has gained international attention, and that is what is referred to as the AUKUS, or the Enhanced Trilateral Security Partnership between Australia, the UK, as well as the United States. And so the Pacific is not just Australia, Hawaii, or New Zealand. The Pacific is the collectivity of small island states throughout Moana-Nui. And so I wanted to highlight and share what different leaders throughout the Pacific have stated with regards to AUKUS, as well as other issues of nuclearization and militarization of the Pacific. And these quotes that I share were from an article written by very competent and amazing journalist out of Melbourne, Australia, Nick McClellan, that he wrote just in the past week or so. And so I wanted to highlight Prime Minister Sagovari of the Solomon Islands. In his address to the United Nations General Assembly, he stated, "We would like to keep our region nuclear free and put the region's nuclear legacy behind us. We do not support any form of militarization in our region that could threaten regional and international peace and stability." Similar, President Mau of Kiribati stated, quote, "With anything to do with nuclear, we thought it would be a courtesy to raise it, to discuss it with your neighbors as small island states." He added, "We thought we were part of the solution. We are in the Pacific family and we should be consulted." And that is his response to the AUKUS announcement. Prime Minister Ardern from Aotearoa, New Zealand, stated, "Certainly they could not come into our internal waters. No vessels that are partially or fully powered by nuclear energy is able to enter our internal borders." So she is setting the limit in terms of their connection with Australia and their close proximity, so as to say, no, we will not be party to that. Prime Minister of Fiji, Bainimarama, to the UN General Assembly stated, quote, "The commitment of the Pacific Island nations to the elimination of nuclear weapons is not based on an abstraction. It is based on real experience with the consequences of nuclear fallout, and it is at the root of our sense of urgency." This position is echoed by President Kabua of the RMI when he stated, quote, "We tirelessly underscore that no people or nation should ever have to bear a burden such as ours, and that no effort should be spared to move towards a world free of nuclear weapons and nuclear risk." And so these two global leaders from Fiji and from RMI put at the front of our minds the fact that as Pacific peoples, the experience of the damaging effects of nuclear weapons and testing is a firsthand experience that we've had historically. And it's for this reason that the base in our voices should be honored and should be respected, because these are not construct abstractions, but rather firsthand experiences of the Pacific. And sharing a few more, Prime Minister Marape of PNG, "We will make sure our sovereignty is not influenced by what happens in Australia and elsewhere. Our waters and our sovereignty will be protected by our own specific bilaterals we have we have with all nations. We have a very peaceful part of the planet Earth. We want to protect that peace and serenity. And as far as securing peace is concerned, we've got no problem. But if such activities bring disharmony in the region, then we will have an issue. Former Prime Minister Henry Puna of the Cook Islands, who was the Prime Minister of the Cooks at the time of the signing of the Treaty of Rarotonga, says, despite 36 years of the Treaty of Rarotonga and 25 years since the permanent cessation of nuclear testing in our region, the nuclear threat remains, exacerbated by the permanent intergenerational consequences and impacts of nuclear weapons. So what you see articulated here in the voice of these different Pacific leaders across the region is that you start to glean this tension that exists between the big countries of the Pacific and our small island states who are being and asserting their right and asserting their leadership and their empowerment to say, we will not participate in militarization or in nuclearization of our region. And so as I close my conversations, my discussions, my talks today about these issues of militarization of the Pacific, looking through the lens of climate change, as well as through the lens of the impacts, the negative impacts of this experience, I wanted to end with something with a poem by Kathy Jetnell Kilgener titled Entitled. And so it speaks for itself. And so I share now her poem. Just give me 1 second here while I bring it forth. I'm coming to meet you. I'm coming.
If you indulge me, I'll pull it up because apparently it didn't translate when I was recording. Do we have a few minutes, Annette? Can I pull it up so that you can see it directly from YouTube? We have a few minutes?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, I'll do that instead. Because
Well, while Lisa's doing that, can I just let you know, all of you who've joined by Zoom, because of the interplay between the Hoover platform for the Peace Congress, we've had to disable the chat on Zoom. So if you would like to ask Lisa a question, you'll need to use the hand up in reactions to let us know that you'd like to ask her a question. We do have one pre-recorded question, and I think we'll take a short period to open up for questions to Lisa before we move on to Clinton's presentation.
And if they've joined through Hoover, they need to use participant.
And if you've joined through Hoover, you need to use the participants box on Hoover.
okay, I'm trying to find it.
How are you going?
I think this Hoover throws things off a little bit. So are you seeing my screen now in the screen share? You are? Oh,
see your YouTube screen.
Unfortunately, I don't have YouTube Premium that doesn't have the commercial, so you're going to have to indulge me for a few seconds while I skip the ad.
I just sent you the email with the client.
Doc now, I think it's an older version. Can you send an updated?
Monica.
Okay, now we can get started.
I'm coming to meet you. I'm coming to see you. What stories will I find? Will I find an island or a tomb? To get to this tomb, take a canoe. Take a canoe through miles of scattered sun. Swallow endless swirling sea. Gulp down radioactive lagoon. Do not bring flowers or speeches. There will be no white stones to scatter along this grave. There will be no songs to sing. How shall we remember you? You were a whole island once. You were breadfruit trees, heavy with green globes of fruit, whispering promises of massive canoes. Crabs dusted with white sand scuttled through pandanus roots. Beneath looming coconut trees, beds of watermelons slept still, swollen with juice. And you were protected by powerful Eroid chiefs birthed from women who could swim pregnant for miles beneath a full moon. Then you became testing ground. 9 nuclear weapons consumed you one by one by one, engulfed in an inferno of blazing heat. You became crater, an empty belly. Plutonium ground into a concrete slurry filled your hollow caverns. You became tomb. You became concrete shell. You became solidified history. Immovable, unforgettable. You were a whole island once. Who remembers you beyond your death? Who would have us forget that you were once green globes of fruits, pandanus roots, and whispers of canoes? Who knows the stories of the life you led before? Here is a story of a turtle goddess. She gifted one of her sons, Leda, a piece of her shell anointed with power, a leathery green fragment, hollow as a piece of bark. It gave Leda the power to transform into anything, into houses and trees, the shapes of other men, even kindling for the first fire. He almost burned us alive. I'm looking for more stories. I look and I look. There must be more to this than incinerated trees, a cracked dome, a rising sea, a leaking nuclear waste with no fence. There must be more to this than a concrete shell that houses death. Here's the story of another shell, anointed with power. Leodao used it to transform into kindling for the first fire. He gave this fire to a small boy. The boy almost burned his entire village to the ground. Licks of fire leapt from skin and bones, from strands of coconut leaves. While the boy cried, Leodao laughed. This is a story of a people on fire. We pretend it is not burning all of us. Here is a story of the ways we've been tricked, the lies we've been fed. It's not poisonous anymore. Your illnesses are normal. You're fine. You're fine. My belly is a crater empty of stories and answers. Only questions. Hard as concrete. Who gave them this power? Who anointed them with the power to burn?
Thank you.
Grammarly can help you write quickly and confidently,
so you never have to slow down at work.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Now I'll go back to gallery. Welcome to people who've arrived a little bit after we started. We've just had a wonderful overview and engagement, particularly with that poem at the end, which really brings it all home. Thanks so much, Lisa. I think we've got time just to spend, a short period on any questions that people have got for Lisa before we move on to Clinton. I do have one that had been sent to us before this from Cora Fabros, and I'm going to put that one forward first, Lisa. What factors contribute to the rising military spending and weaponization in the Asia and Pacific region? What would be the strongest force that can contribute to the building of critical mass that can make a difference for the region to move towards its demilitarization and denuclearization? So would you like to take that one on?
Sure. Thank you, Tita Cora, for your question. And I think, Quinton's going to speak a lot about this in terms of the polarized tensions between the US and China and what's being created. And I think that's largely the justification that's given for the massive military buildup, certainly on Wuhan, right? So in 2006 was the announcement, and quote unquote, the containment of China was the reason that we were given for that. And related to your second question, which I love to talk with Cora about, this whole idea of critical mass, because for those who may not know her, she's not only the last president of NFIP, but she also was on the commission that led to the decision to close the US bases, to not renew the agreement with the US. So I often ask her that same question: how did you do that? Right? Given the Philippine context, economic hardships and what have you, very deep sense of neocolonialism with in its relationship with the US. We've spent many hours dissecting that question of how did you convince your community? And she says to me, I don't see your face, Tita, but I don't mean to talk to you about you in the third person, but she often would share with me. And what I remember is her saying, don't be fooled to think that you convince the whole country, right? You just need to convince the critical mass. And I think certainly in the last decade, now growing into the second decade of activism in the Pacific, gems like Kathy really bringing to the global stage these issues that we struggle with in terms of militarism. And, it really is becoming you can no longer avoid the hyper-militarization that exists in all of our communities. And I say that because in Wuhan, for example, things like, for example, a sacred tree, the last endemic tree that is part of the construction pathway of this new base, it really mobilizes a community in terms of an indigenous community that gives sacred meaning to these cultural artifacts for us. What does this tree signify and mean? And, our local legislature, as well as our governor, called on the Department of Defense to pause their massive military construction project so that we can address the issues of this tree. And it was completely overlooked, it wasn't taken into any account. So the consequence of that is a lot of emotions for people in our communities. And I think that alone is really starting to generate a lot of traction in terms of people paying attention in our communities. In our highly militarized communities like Wuhan, there's also a very high sense of US patriotism, which is illogical, but it is because of the war experience. And so we're constantly bumping up against that. And what's beautiful is that the new crop of the younger generation is not seeing those more colonial connections. They're really re-envisioning what society could look like, what our island could be, and that's really refreshing. So I think that's a huge part of being able to cultivate the critical mass as we move forward.
Good advice there. We've got a couple of hands up, one from Bevan Ramsden and one from Barbara Hartley. So I'll go, Bevan, I think was first. Bevan, you'll need to unmute yourself. Thanks. Great.
Lisa, thank you for all that information you gave us, and particularly for that very moving poem at the end. My question is, can we get access to your PowerPoints and the one on the poem, please? Could that be made available for us to have access to?
Absolutely, no problem. I'll send it to Annette. And the poem actually is called Anointed. And if you just go into YouTube and you just put Anointed and Kathy, it'll come up. And if you have the time, watch her different poems. The one that she delivered at the UN to the General Assembly is also very powerful. So much of her work is really, it ignites the heart. And I think it's been very strategic in terms of using that to reach the younger generations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Barbara?
Thank you, Annette. Thank you so much, Lisa. That's quite a lot to come to terms with in that presentation, and particularly the last part. I want to just ask a brief question about the dome, about Runit Dome, and concrete is cancerous and decays, and the concrete is breaking up on that dome. And my understanding was that there's quite a lot of leakage of waste material from it. And I just wonder, is there any project looking at how that's impacting on the people who've wanted to return to their, what is basically their home? It just seems to me to be an extraordinary situation there.
Thank you for that question. I'm not an expert on the Marshals and their situation, but what I do know, and largely through information from Ms. Abaca Anjan Madison, who is primarily the main person from the Marshals who speaks out on these issues, she has shared that a huge part of the challenge related to your question is that most of the studies are funded by the US's Department of Energy.
Right. Yeah.
So when you've got them at the helms in terms of controlling the research by funding, it really influences the questions that are asked in those research studies. So what has been really helpful in partnership with the Marshallese people has been through groups like Gensukyo in Japan, that have brought expert scientists to the Marshall Islands to collect independent samples, to bring them back and to try to make some sense of what's happening in terms of impacts. I often say that as humanity, we are trying to be big boys playing with big toys. And the reason why I say that is because there really isn't the research that exists to be able to understand the long-term impacts of radiation. And, in my presentation yesterday, not today's one, but yesterday's, I actually have some slides of, jellyfish babies and what have you. And according to Abaca, the most recent physical manifestation on bodies, because initially after detonation, there was miscarriages. After miscarriages, babies were able to be born and they were born without bones mostly, right? And then now what you see is, or more recently you saw birth defects, autism, those sorts of things. But the most recent thing she's reporting is that there's tails, right? And before that, what we actually see here in Guam at our hospitals, because Marshallese will come through either Guam or Hawaii for medical care, is, and not just in the Marshalls, because the slew of islands that spread from the Marshalls to the other Caroline Islands that comprise, for example, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Pohnpei state in the FSM is very close and also within downwinds, just like we are from the Marshalls. And what they were seeing a lot of, there's an island that is known as kind of like the blind island, because a lot of the children are born without eyeballs. So those kids come to Guam for medical care. So there's so much that hasn't been researched in terms of long-term impacts of exposure to radiation. And, most of those that are real engaged deeply in the work of in that work will say that for many of these radioactive isotopes, the half-life isn't even here yet, which is when it would have the most damaging effects. So, the word is out, right, in terms of how damaging exactly it is. But what we do know, of course, is in terms of cancers, thyroid cancer is probably the most common. You see this also in mining, other places where there's uranium. But I think that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Thanks, Lisa. One more question and then we'll move on to Clinton's presentation. Vince?
Hi, hi, Lisa. Thanks very much for that wonderful, informative presentation. I was wondering if you could shed any light on what you think are the future intentions of the US military in terms of militarization of Guahan just in the coming years. I know as part of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, the Pentagon's requested a new missile defense system in Guahan. The Pentagon's also looking for places in the region to deploy their ground-launched missiles, particularly after withdrawing from the INF Treaty. And then there's the whole long-term deal, which is supposed to be moving troops from Okinawa to Guahan. Can you just shed any light on what you think is coming and what we should expect in terms of further militarization of Guahan?
Yeah.
What the response is to as well from locals?
Yeah, so the response, honestly, we're completely overwhelmed. We're overwhelmed to the point of silence right now because just as with you folks with Taliban Sabre, I mean, we have had ongoing military exercises here with different countries since May. You know, ospreys from Okinawa we're now seeing here. We never saw that before. So the quote unquote interoperability is in full swing. And because we are a US colony, they literally don't consult us in the decision-making process. And even though the NEPA process, which is the National Environmental Protection Act of the US, requires that they engage and consult the community, right? So that is our only, the only sort of string to consultation. But even that, because we engage that process and in this entire military buildup, right, quote unquote, the military buildup, 11,000 pages worth of description of what they're going to do here. Hang on, I lost my train of thought when I got sidetracked with the 11,000 pages. It's always upsetting to think about. But the plans that they've revealed is really, I mean, there's so many components of this massive plan. And so, yes, the missile defense system is in full swing. As a matter of fact, I was sharing earlier that I got an email from Richard Tanter a couple of days ago asking me to go look by the base development and see if it's up yet. You know, and I told him, send me pictures of what I'm looking for and I'll go out there next weekend and, you know, have a look. But all of it is in full swing and it's no holds bar. It's really scary. And I say that because even, for example, to the north of us in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, they promised as part of their covenant agreement with the CNMI, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands is CNMI. In their covenant agreement, they leased 3/4 of Tinian Island, right? But they never actually developed it, right? And that was, you know, it's been decades now. In the Guam military buildup, in the draft environmental impact statement, there's one whole chapter on Tinian Island. And in that chapter, it quantifies the value of each home on that island. So you know that the potential for what they could do there is huge, because I think the only reason they quantified the value of those homes is to buy out, you know, people's, basically so they could have full run of the island. And of late, even though you don't see it written anywhere, but if you ask people from the CNMI, all the jobs are in Tinian because of the full swing expansion even there. And then the talks that the US, the Department of Defense, the President or the Secretary of State Blinken has had with the President of Palau, you know, and this new president that they have is no Salih. I mean, he's not one that's resisted. As a matter of fact, he's rolled out the royal carpet. I mean, it really makes you wonder what was the carrot that changed Palau's position, because the previous president, Tommy Romengasau, was very staunch in terms of protecting the environment, right? Palau is now a no commercial fishing zone, you know, in their waters. Like, they have very progressive policies and they take pride in protecting their environment. And then you saw just this switch with Romengasau. I don't know what that's about, but they are definitely the different FAS states, which is the Republic of Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. All three of them are experiencing extreme pressure from the US. And part of why they don't, I mean, they're treading on very delicate water is because in their compacts of free association, they essentially have given the US carte blanche in terms of handling issues of foreign affairs, or what they call substantive foreign affairs. In other words, when it's important, the US can step in and make those decisions. So in the case of Palau, you see the alignment with Taiwan. I believe you see the same thing with the Marshall Islands, but the Federated States of Micronesia is being a little bit more strategic. They're pulling back. They're saying they can be everybody's friend, so it's going to be interesting to see. But clearly the whole region is just on fire in terms of military development.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Well, if there are other questions people have got on their minds after Clinton has delivered his talk, and we've put all those questions to Clinton as well, and I'm sure both maybe Lisa and Clinton might want to add responses to some of the questions that will come up in after Clinton's talk. So Clinton Fernandes, I think you all know Clinton. He's a professor at the University of New South Wales. His research is very varied. It focuses on emerging technologies of all kinds, hypersonic missiles to electromagnetic pulse weapons. My goodness, Clinton, you must have a head full of knowledge, as well as that you write amazing pieces on current affairs and foreign affairs. You're an incredible asset to Australia. And I'm going to pass over to you now. Thank you, Clinton.
Thanks. I hope I'm unmuted now. Thanks. Would you like me to answer Vince's question first? It won't take long.
Sure.
Vince, the basic point is that Okinawa is only 460 nautical miles away from China. And so it's too close for comfort. The US knows it'll simply get that base, the Kadena Air Base, destroyed there. So they've relocated their Marines from Okinawa to Guam and elsewhere. And the idea is to have a very developed radar system in Hawaii, as well as a different kind of radar in Palau, and then place air power in the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, as well as Palau. The reason for this is they need a joint fires network. They don't have it yet, but the vision is that they want any sensor from any platform to be able to provide targeting guidance to any weapon in that area. But they need to get out of Okinawa and at least to Guam and maybe even further, simply because China can project power closer to its shores. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Clinton. That's great. Thank you.
No worries. All right. Well, thank you very much, the organizers, for inviting me to speak. Thank you for organizing it. It's easy for us to do research. The hard work of negotiations and agreements and things like that is really what the organizers do. Always grateful to them for it. My core proposition is that we don't have to choose between a US-centered imperial order and a Chinese-centered order whenever that happens. The real alternative is a democratic and equitable international order. Now, that phrase isn't as familiar as the so-called rules-based international order. And the reason you may not have heard of that phrase, democratic, equitable international order, is that it's not been discussed even once in the major United States or Australian media in the decade since September 2011, when the developing world has been formally considering it every year at the United Nations. And so it's important to bring that phrase, the democratic, equitable international order, onto the agenda and made part of the conversation between our countries and in our countries. Firstly, simply to bring it to the attention of our own population, because it's presented as a false binary that if you don't like the United States-led order, then what do you want, the Chinese-led order? And how can you accept a one-party state, as though those are the only two choices? And so, since I was asked to speak about visions and so on, I just offer the observation that visions are helpful if they are accompanied by realistic programs of action. Anybody can stand at the door of a chess club and tell chess players, checkmate the king. That's not helpful advice. The real task is to analyze individual chessboards, and then answer a meaningful question. On this chessboard, what's the correct move now? And that's what makes visions relevant and serious, rather than fanciful and indulgent. So I intend to talk about what a democratic and equitable order would look like, not from whatever comes to mind or what I think is a great idea, but what is the international consensus, at least in the developing world? What have those debates been been talking about, and what can we do to further that? Well, the first thing is a preference for diplomacy rather than threat exchange. It's not about demilitarization or giving up your weaponry, as though either you go to war or you have no military. Rather, what they say is the diplomatic option should go first. And this is very relevant to the current tensions and the prospect of war in the Taiwan Strait. There's a popular misconception that the tensions relate to the freedom of navigation. Now, that's utterly false. I'm going to explain why. The real issue, which you're not being told about, is that can one country conduct military and intelligence activities in another country's exclusive economic zone? The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was negotiated in 1982, came into force more than a decade later, and it established what's called exclusive economic zones. EEZs, or exclusive economic zones, are waters that extend 200 nautical miles from a coastline into the sea. And the EEZ gives coastal states the right to regulate economic activities like fishing and oil exploration. The United States hasn't ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, but it does say that it acts in accordance with the convention. And so it's established its own exclusive economic zone within 200 nautical miles of its coastlines. It's recognized other states' exclusive economic zones. China has also ratified, established its own exclusive economic zone. It has ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, and it recognizes other states' exclusive economic zones. So what's the problem? The problem is that the United States says that it has the right to conduct military activities and intelligence collection activities within any country's exclusive economic zone, and that it can conduct those activities as close as 12 nautical miles from that country's coastline, which are those territorial waters. The US is not being hypocritical here. It actually accepts the right of other countries to do that inside its own exclusive economic zone. Even during the Cold War, the United States never interfered with Soviet ships, Soviet bombers, or Soviet surveillance aircraft that periodically flew close to US airspace. If a Chinese armada were to show up inside the US's exclusive economic zone, the US wouldn't interfere with it. Now, what China disagrees. China says that it respects freedom of navigation, but it doesn't accept that foreign countries can conduct military and intelligence collection activities within its own exclusive economic zone. So it's got nothing to do with freedom of navigation. It's got to do with this ambiguity, because the Law of the Sea Convention is silent on the question of whether you can use other countries' exclusive economic zones to send your own military and to collect intelligence and things like that. Now, that's at the center of the incidents between US and Chinese ships and aircraft since at least 2001. And this issue is separate from every question of territorial disputes and 9-dash lines. Everything else going on in the South China Sea and the East China Sea has got nothing to do with freedom of navigation. If all the maritime border questions are resolved, the freedom of navigation question, and as to whether you can do all these things inside other countries' EEZs, that would remain. And so what exactly does the convention say? The convention just says that you can't conduct any threat of force or the use of force inside EEZs. Well, is a military exercise inside another country's EEZs the use of force or the threat of force? And that the Law of the Sea Convention is ambiguous on that. So this cries out for a diplomatic solution rather than provocative naval armadas. So there's no reason to think that one should simply give up the US alliance or get rid of ANZUS. No, it's a question of, well, let's negotiate first. Why do you think that you need to have you have the right to conduct exclusive economic zone military activities around the world in every country's EEZ? Or China, why do you think that's not the case? So that's diplomacy. Now, the United States knows that Indonesia, the Philippines, and India quietly support China's perspective. In April of this year, 2021, the United States conducted military activities inside the Indian exclusive economic zone. It's called the freedom of navigation, of course. And India protested it bitterly. They're very angry about this thing. They couldn't say anything. So now, if China has one view, which is supported by Indonesia, the Philippines, and India, you can tell why those countries support this. It's because look at the geography, and they are threatened by military activities in their own exclusive economic zones. Sometimes the Philippines would support China's position to protect itself from China and Chinese vessels in the future. So why does the United States insist on this right? And the answer is about 35% of the world is somebody's exclusive economic zone. And if the US can't conduct military activities there, that means it can't project power into the Middle East. It can't project power into the Persian Gulf. It can't project power into the Mediterranean Sea. Pretty much the United States is a global maritime power. And if it's barred from 200 nautical miles away from every other country's coastline, then of course it loses its intimidatory power. And so that's why it objects to it, not just because of China's problems or China's objections, but if China's concept were to become universalized and become part of international law, then it simply couldn't, the United States couldn't project power or couldn't legitimately send, let's say, the 7th Fleet, for example, into the Persian Gulf or whatever else, the 6th Fleet somewhere else. And so that calls for diplomacy first rather than negotiations. So what else would a democratic and equitable international order look like? Well, first thing is, of course, the pandemic. We know that the pandemic has affected the $90 trillion global economy, and it's affected the economies of countries, both inside the country and with respect to others. And one thing that should be understood is that if you only spent between 22 and 30 billion US dollars a year, I'll say that again, between 22 and 30 billion US dollars a year to reduce deforestation and curb wildlife trafficking, you will stop any risk or any feasible risk of the next pandemic. Now, how is this the case? It's because tropical forest edges are a major launch pad for novel human viruses. Obviously human wildlife contacts increase the risk of pandemics. And we have a very proven recent example of success. Between 2005 and 2012, Brazil's deforestation efforts saw deforestation in the Amazon drop by 20%, while still managing to increase production of the soybean crop. It's been funded by international contributions, complemented by an Amazon fund of about $1 billion in support of land use zoning, satellite monitoring, market and credit restrictions, and so on. And so Brazil's program, this is obviously not the current government of Brazil, but between 2005 and 2012, they reduced forest fragmentation at a lower cost that could have been achieved by even carbon pricing approaches. Now, of course, a different government is in power in Brazil, but the fact remains that for only $1.5 billion a year, you could have implement that same policy worldwide by simply removing subsidies that favor deforestation, that restrict private land clearing, and by supporting the territorial rights of indigenous people. It's shocking to think with all the money being spent on radars and maritime power, that no global agency currently has a remit to conduct surveillance on the wildlife trade. International conventions, such as the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Fauna and Flora, has an annual budget for its wildlife enforcement network. An annual budget, this is in the ASEAN section, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Its annual budget is just $30,000 US, not 30 million or 30 billion, $30,000 US. And the entire annual budget for globally for the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species is a mere $6 million $6 million US. And so helping to prevent the next outbreak would be one benefit if you increase that budget. I mean, that's a humanitarian intervention. You could do a humanitarian intervention by strengthening those things rather than all these humanitarian interventions that involve military force. Now, the democratic, equitable international order people do talk about the rights of indigenous peoples and those in remote communities for whom wildlife can provide essential protein. But beyond that, the proposals are quite sensible, simply because it's very feasible, and for a statistical error in the budget, you can prevent the chance of the next pandemic. What else does it is a democratic and equitable international order? Well, they say that sanctions should not happen unilaterally. Economic and military sanctions must respect international humanitarian law, in particular, the principle of distinction, which requires states to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and between military objectives and civilian objectives. And if they don't respect that distinction, then they constitute an unlawful blockade and are collective reprisals, which are banned under international humanitarian law. They also say that economic and military sanctions must require the authority of the United Nations Security Council. They shouldn't be applied unilaterally. But instead, we've seen the proliferation of new types of unilateral sanctions, which derive from the United States dollar's role as the system's primary reserve asset. And they say, for example, that if you trade with this or that country that we have now slapped a unilateral sanction on, then we will deny you the right to conduct any banking in the United States. Now, given the fact that the US dollar is so central to international trade, given the fact that you can't really do business as a bank anywhere in the world unless you have a correspondent banking relationship with the United States, because that's how you reconcile accounts anytime one of your customers wants to buy something online or whatever else. If you decide as a provider, we're using Zoom, for example, and so if Zoom were to allow its services to be used in Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, and other states, then the US could simply sanction it, that company. And so communication software like Zoom actually bans people in Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, etc. They can't have online meetings and webinars. There are no COVID exemptions for training for doctors, or no COVID exemptions to implement telemedicine services. Iran's unable to buy and install up-to-date flight planning software because of United States sanctions. And so what the debates at the UN General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council have involved about a democratic and equitable international order is that sanctions have to be authorized by the UN Security Council, and they cannot be allowed to be imposed unilaterally. They also talk about freedom, and the fact that freedom is a good in itself. The right to freedom of opinion and expression includes the right to be wrong. It includes the right to offend people at times. Memory laws, which pretend to crystallize history into a politically correct narrative, are anti-democratic. They offend human dignity and endanger domestic as well as international democracy. And so this whole idea of cancel culture and no platforming and things like that, I think is firstly contrary to good sense and good morals. Certainly tactically it's suicidal, but also it's against a democratic and equitable international order, because the right to freedom of opinion and expression includes the right to be wrong, includes the right to offend. They also talk about ending tax havens and preventing international institutions from enhancing tax havens. For example, in 2015, it was found that of the 68 companies that borrowed money from the World Bank's private lending arm to finance investments in sub-Saharan Africa, 51 of the 68 companies used tax havens. And they serve no economic purpose, and they should end. Now, there have been steps towards an international agreement on taxation and international cooperation in tax matters, and these are obviously welcome. And part of the reason that's happening is international support for a democratic and equitable international order. They also talk about a reform of the United Nations Security Council by saying you require at least 2 votes to exercise a veto. There's 2 votes among permanent members, and by obliging vetoing states to report their rationales to the General Assembly. And that would prevent the use of the veto power to shield states from criticism or from multilateral sanctions. One of the most important things, which is simply impossible to convey in certain countries, is the right to food. It's not understood as a meaningful or a substantive issue here, but it's of crucial significance in many parts of the world. In 2021, at least 155 million people experienced acute food insecurity. And it's hard to convey here that the most important human rights organizations in the world are the World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, of the United Nations. We think of human rights organizations as, I mean, rightly so, as Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or things like that. But in fact, the most important human rights organization in the world, by one way of looking at it, is the World Food Programme and the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, simply because of the extent of hunger. And that relates to the fact of the world's food systems being increasingly controlled by agribusiness companies. For those of us who are on this call and who remember all the debates in the late 1990s as the World Trade Organization was being negotiated and about to be signed, every criticism made by people at the time has been vindicated. So if what I'm saying sounds like it's pretty obvious if you're of a certain age, well, at least you can take some comfort in the fact that you were right. The other thing they talk about is an end to austerity programs and structural adjustment programs. But what they do say is you've got to start with credit ratings agencies. Credit ratings agencies play a crucial role in the international financial system. They contributed to the US subprime mortgage crisis, the global financial crisis of 2007, as well as the Eurozone debt crisis. Now, they are in fact an oligopoly. The credit rating agencies are not some sort of democratic system. Standard & Poor's and Fitch Ratings and Moody's Investors, so those three credit rating agencies control 94% of outstanding credit ratings. And they have been recognized as official ratings agencies as a result of the introduction of rules by the US Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, these rating agencies are overly optimistic or lax at the top of the economic cycle and too severe at the bottom of the business cycle. They encourage overborrowing during good times and deepen the debt crisis during a crisis by triggering market panic and the resultant capital outflows and currency depreciations. They are not held accountable for inaccurate ratings because they claim that they are shielded from liability by the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. They say, yes, we're giving you a rating, but it's only our opinion, it's not a judgment. And so it's shielded by freedom of speech, even though this kind of freedom of speech is actually an act. Okay, if I go into a shop and you've got the pistol and you tell a shopkeeper, give me your money, I tell you to shoot. It's not just speech, it's a speech act. But given the fact that these rating agencies cannot be held accountable, they can't be, investors and borrowers can't be protected from mistakes. This sort of thing is not even reported in the press here. And part of the reason I'm speaking about it is to just raise awareness so we can try and bring it onto the agenda. There have been attempts to hold credit rating agencies to the same standard of expert liability that auditors and lawyers face. But these agencies protested and threatened to freeze their ratings, and so all those rules were shelved. Now, the United Nations has actually advocated for an international public credit rating agency to provide objective, expert-based ratings of the creditworthiness of sovereigns and companies, including developing countries. And so those are some of the problems with those rating agencies. And the other problem is that their assessments are biased against most kinds of government intervention and against workers' rights, what they call labor market rigidities. And they show a preference to give good ratings for countries that implement austerity measures. I can't actually emphasize how important that is, because it actually affects the developing world's access to capital, which they need. And this is part of the explanation for why some countries which actually want demilitarization have to agree. This is some of the things that Lisa was talking about. They have to agree to foreign pressure because they do have to look after their people. The last thing I'd like to say about a democratic and equitable international order is the need for people-to-people links, in particular, to find ways of exchanging information about what exactly does the foreign aid program in Australia fund. We know that there is an aid budget, and we know that it has an effect in the Southwest Pacific, in Papua New Guinea, in Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, and elsewhere, East Timor, for example. where the aid program was used as a cover to conduct espionage against the government of Timor. There's very little information available, except with great effort, about monitoring the role of Australian diplomacy overseas. We don't have anything like a DFAT watch. And one way to do that would be to encourage exchange of information between Australia and our neighbours, so that we can work out what exactly is being funded. As it happens, I have an association with a very good organisation in Australia called AidWatch. You can find them at aidwatch.org.au, and they're outgunned, punch above their weight, but they try and shed light on Australia's aid program, and have been doing so for many years. Organizations like this deserve support and have their voices should be amplified, and perhaps find ways of exchanging information. This is a very good first step. And there was a question from Bevan Ramsden to Dr. Lisa Natividad about the quotes, getting those PowerPoint presentations to us. And that's important because many of our people actually don't know anything about those other countries, and perhaps vice versa. So I think those are the essential elements of a democratic and equitable international order. And just to remind everyone that it's a false binary. It's actually a triumph of the propaganda system that the phrase democratic and equitable international order is not reported in the press here or in the United States. It's just never been discussed. It would be a good first step to actually make it part of the agenda. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Clinton. That certainly is a challenge for us to work on, having that understood about the long history of the democratic and equitable international order, which I will attempt to get my head around and my mouth around. Now, I do have a few pre-sent questions for you, Clinton, which I'm going to start with. Thank you very much for your talk. There's a lot in it. In relation to the global financial system, the question is, what would reform of the international financial system look like, and how might it be initiated? And are there currently any such campaigns? Are there any templates or templates in another country that Australia could adopt or that could be proposed here?
Australia is extremely small, as far as comparisons with the global financial system is concerned. Reforms of the system will have to come from a coalition of countries, one of which, of course, could include Australia. The reason the international financial system is undemocratic derives from the US dollar's role as the system's primary reserve asset. The US dollar is the most heavily traded currency in foreign exchange markets. It's involved in 85 to 89% of all transactions between 1999 and 2016. About 65% of all the foreign exchange reserves in the world, this is in other countries, are held in US dollars. 64% of the foreign currencies that every other country has, you add it all up, 64% are US dollars. And that's 3 times more than the holdings of the euro. International trade is invoiced in dollars at a far higher rate than is justified by the US share of global imports. 40% of all debt securities are denominated in dollars. The dollar accounts for 60% of all cross-border bank liabilities. And so the more realistic workaround is occurring through an organization called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. Now, there's nothing that you can do about it, I don't think, anyway. We who are minnows, we can't do anything about it. But if you want to keep an eye on what's happening, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, over the last 20 years, the United States has been pushed out of Central Asia. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization includes, of course, China, where it started, the Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan and the other stars. India is a member, so is Pakistan, so is Russia. And there is a a move for them to conduct trade and exchange, in a China-based system with Chinese technological standards, but for them to conduct trade and exchange in their own currencies, and so that's one way of doing it. But there is simply no alternative meaningful challenge to the US dollar in the financial system. What we can do, though, in Australia is, simply call for greater regulation of banks. I just don't see why we can't impose financial transaction taxes on trading that occurs all the time. I mean, there are things we can do in the banking sector, but I think at the global level, given what I've said, given the fact that we're like 1% of the world's GDP, I just don't see Australia as being able to make a meaningful difference.
Yeah. Would anyone here like to ask a question of Clinton? And if so, use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand. I've got another question for you, Clinton, which came up with Lisa's talk as well. The Treaty of Rarotonga was signed and ratified by 13 nations in 1985, including Australia and New Zealand. Do you think the treaty would be violated if Australia allows nuclear-powered and armed vessels or aircraft to enter our territory, including the 200 nautical mile EEZ?
No, the Treaty of Rarotonga was enacted. The Treaty of Rarotonga was something that the South Pacific countries wanted, but the treaty that actually got enacted was a result of very intense Hawke government pressure. The Hawke government was involved. We're going back a long time now, the 1980s, the early 1980s even, when there was David Lange had been elected as Prime Minister of New Zealand in '84, and there was 600,000 people marched on Palm Sunday in 1984. There was a diverse anti-nuclear movement. There was a call for an end to uranium mining, call to close US bases in Australia, to terminate nuclear armed warships and plane visits, and there was talk about a nuclear-free zone in the Indian Pacific Oceans. And so what Hawke's role was to depoliticize the US alliance. And so Bill Hayden was, in order to gain control of disarmament policy, take it away from the public, appointed a diplomat as ambassador for disarmament to represent Australia abroad and to bring the debate in Australia in line with government policy. There was a peace research center set up, I think, at ANU, so academics could go and write about peace. It's easy to co-opt people at times. I mean, some good work was done, of course. But the point being, it took the heat out of the movement. And so the Treaty of Rarotonga that finally wound up being signed was much weaker than what many South Pacific nations wanted. It was designed, I'm quoting now from an Australian cabinet record, that it was designed to maintain the security advantages of the US presence in the region. So the Treaty of Rarotonga doesn't ban the transit of nuclear-armed warships and submarines, and it doesn't ban missile tests in the Marshall Islands, doesn't ban the US retaining its nuclear arsenal in Guam. Even the Chemical Weapons Convention negotiations, the way it was done was the US told Australia that it wanted to water down proposals for a global ban on chemical weapons. Okay, so the US wanted to water down those proposals for a global ban. So Australia then tabled a US proposal as though it was an Australian proposal, and then told the rest of the world, we will go and insist to the United States that they adopt this proposal. In fact, it was a secret US proposal. And so according to one account of these negotiations, we agreed to this ruse in order to foster negotiating momentum. So to a large extent, no, none of these legal instruments are ways of opposing the transit of nuclear submarines or nuclear-armed or nuclear-powered ships and vessels, no.
Lisa, would you like to make comment at all there? You need to unmute, Lisa.
Sorry about that. Just that, I think another, can you hear me okay? You hear me okay? Another piece of the situation, I think also that needs to be considered, and it's related but connected, is what got played out in the PIF right, recently with Micronesia pretty much exiting the PIF, the Pacific Island Forum. And that, you know, from what I understand, there was a quote, what we call a quote unquote gentleman's agreement, right? That Micronesia would next come to the helm in terms of the leadership of the PIF. And in the vote that didn't happen. And so Micronesia, anticipating that that would happen, made it clear. And so you see here again, as Clinton is saying, right, these geopolitical plays in terms of the US or the French or the Australian, right, in terms of influencing these small states and who they have these strong ties and relationships, mostly economical, or economic relationships that's also very much connected to their military presence in those countries. And so I think it's a really tough situation that a lot of these small island developing states are in, you know, and you see that, like, earlier I was talking about the Federated States of Micronesia, you know, the FSM, and how they're trying to do the delicate dance, right, of not aligning with either of the polarization, right, that's being presented in terms of the US or China. But the reality is so much of the resources, and I say this because even in our own engagement with our regional neighbors for support of the decolonization of our island, we have a very difficult time, you know, and these are literally our kin, you know, in our regional neighborhood in Micronesia. And so I think the kinds of pressures that they're under, there's lots of pieces of that story that, you know, that needs to be revealed in terms of us really understanding a lot of those decisions. So.
Thanks, Lisa. That's and now, would anyone like to ask a question here in the group? I've got a few more questions I can put to Clinton and Lisa. To Clinton, could you elaborate on how Australia and other nations in the region can prepare for deciding to not choose US imperial directives? Now that's a big question, and we've heard people like, oh no, I'm going to forget his name, but there's been a number of experts saying, well, you know, you are either with us or against us, and if you're not with us, then you then become the enemy. So I'd like to hear what you think about how we can prepare for actually taking a more independent stance in our relationship with the United States.
Well, I mean, we can't really have an independent foreign policy if you've got a dependent economy. It's the economy itself is under, you know, largely Australian and US control. But I want to kind of be very practical and precise here. Firstly, there is a vulnerability in the claim by the United States to project power and the establishment here, and that is that they actually do rely on perceptions of legitimacy. You know, there's nothing actually physically stopping the United States from sending its vessels into other countries' exclusive economic zones. What worries them about the Chinese position is the sense that it may not be perceived as legitimate around the world. So the need to have soft power, the need to have its actions perceived around the world as legitimate is quite important to the US. And so if it were explained that in fact a rules-based international order is really a US-led imperial system, then that delegitimizes it without giving away the store. It also helps to understand the role of public opinion in Australia. Australian public opinion is consistent in its support for the US alliance. More than 70% have always supported the alliance with the United States. And yes, you can say as much as you like that, well, ANZUS doesn't actually formally commit them to anything else and things like that. But, you know, you don't fight against the reality. The reality is 3 out of every 4 Australians supports the US alliance. Now, what do they actually support? They support the alliance in the sense that it might be a guarantee against a future threat to Australia. There's no real support, you know, there's no automatic support for US expeditionary operations. That has to be built. So one way to explain your opposition to submarines and nuclear-powered submarines is to be very clear that you don't actually oppose submarines. You know, I myself have no problem with conventionally powered submarines. More than that, I think if you were to propose an independent defense policy and to do it seriously, you would have to call for an Australian conventional submarine fleet, because the capability of developing those submarines it takes years. You can't just turn it on and off. It's not like recruiting people to the infantry. You know, with a 3-month training program, you need to have an entire culture of submariners. You also make Australia safer by asking for conventionally powered submarines, because anti-submarine warfare is extremely high, and very few countries in the world have mastered it. China has not yet gotten it. And so simply possessing an effective fleet of conventionally powered submarines would raise the cost of hostile action to any potential adversary to Australia. And so when people say, I don't want submarines, or we need more healthcare, let's get rid of the submarines, I know exactly how that's going to play out at the level of public opinion. They say, okay, well, if you don't care too much about defending Australia, I don't care too much about you. Okay, so if the first thing people say is we need better healthcare, we need this or that, let's get rid of the F-111s, let's get rid of the Joint Strike Fighter, let's get rid of the submarines. Okay, well, if you don't care about public opinion, then of course that's a recipe for irrelevance. 3 out of 4 Australians for years, like this goes back to the Australian election study of 1987, including all the way till today, they believe in a defense force. Now, if you genuinely believe in a defense force, then you believe that defense force should be effective. You believe that defense force should have intelligence capabilities. Otherwise, you don't believe in a defense force. You believe that defense force should have submarines. Otherwise, you don't believe in a defense force. You believe that defense force should have long-range missiles as a defensive thing. You believe the Australian Defence Force should be for defense, not offense. Okay, but you actually have to believe in the defense force, or you have to come up with a credible posture. So that's one way of doing it. If you simply say, well, I just want to get rid of ANZUS or whatever else, I think the answer to that is very clear as to what the consequences of that are going to be.
You're muted, Annette.
Bevan, you'd like to ask your question?
Thank you, Annette. To Clinton, is armed neutrality a feasible defence option for Australia?
Yes. Okay. So the way to get your head around this is to go to the Australian Army Research Centre.
Did I just? So sorry, I've just muted you by mistake, Clinton.
Okay, I'm back. Yes. Okay. So what I would say is there has been some serious thinking about this. The Australian Army Research Centre a few months ago published one of the most important studies that most relevant studies that we need this decade, and it's called "On Planning to Not Lose Towards a New Way of War, a New Philosophy of War," and that was written by a very important strategist called Dr. Albert Palazzo, and he talks about what it would be to have armed sovereignty. So you can still have the alliance, you can still have intelligence facilities, you can still have, the things that the public regards as important. But what you want to do is you want to provide enough of a credible defense posture to make it impossible, or make it extremely hard for any hostile country to target us. And so that would require getting long-range missiles. Okay, I'm not talking about ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons or anything like that, but you basically want to be able to deny a 2,000 kilometer zone from the northern approaches and the northeastern approaches, and that would require a better trained army that is not simply there to provide battalions for the occupation of Afghanistan or Iraq, but to actually focus on the defense of Australia. You would want to have an air force that's optimized to fly to, say, any of the island countries and come back. At the moment, the Royal Australian Air Force has been optimized to essentially to be a wing of the United States Air Force. And that's exactly what Dr. Albert Palazzo himself says. And so if you were to do that, then you would need to have conventional submarines. You would need to have an army, because, the air defense artillery groups like that, they would need to be there. And the Australian Army Research Centre has looked at this. It was, in fact, the last paper that Albert Palazzo did before he retired. And at the top levels of the military, what I'm saying is not a secret. It's not a surprise. They know what I'm saying, that this is at the very top levels, that Palazzo is right, that, we if we wanted to defend Australia, we could. And you'd need to have those long-range missiles, you need to have subs, you need to have a credible air force. And so, yes, Australia is defensible at pretty much any realistic threat scenario.
Thanks, Clinton. Vince.
Thanks, Annette. Thanks, Clinton. It's nice to see you too, by the way, even if virtually. I had a question about your discussion about military and intelligence activities in foreign extended economic zones. Earlier this year during Talisman Sabre, I'm sure you remember, the Chinese sent a spy ship to Australia's EEZ, and even into Talisman Sabre 2019, I believe, as well. And they were conducting allegedly passive intelligence activities. And there were two responses in the media here. One of them was, oh, well, this is an unfriendly act by China, and there's a big hoo-ha about it. And the other response was, well, actually, no, we can't say that it's an unfriendly act because, well, we do that too, or at least the United States does that in China's EEZ, and that's perfectly consistent with international law. But it's hypocritical of China because, they complain about intelligence activities that the United States conducts in its EEZ, but here they are doing this in our EEZ. But one perspective that wasn't reported was the Chinese perspective, which, from what I understand, is not that they are object to kind of passive intelligence activities in their EEZ, or at least they tolerate passive intelligence activities in their EEZ. But more the kind of sophisticated, aggressive, controversial intelligence activities like ship-to-shore communication, interfering of ship-to-shore communications, and active tickling of radar systems to get a response, and dropping of sonar buoys to track their, submarines, which they consider to be, preparation of the battlefield, and therefore a threat to use of force, and therefore a violation of the UN Charter. Is that position of China defensible from the perspective of international law, or is international law on the side of the United States when it comes to these very kind of sophisticated, aggressive types of intelligence and military activities that they conduct in?
Hi. Yeah. Thanks, Vince. The Law of the Sea Convention is silent on this question, right? And China's behavior has been very cute and hypocritical. Let me explain what I mean. That they are quite happy to conduct intelligence gathering and presence operations where you just park your ship in other countries' exclusive economic zones. I think at least once they've done it with exercises involving the use of weapons and explosives. And so there's an obvious contradiction between what they say other countries should be allowed or should not be allowed to do in their EEZ and what they do. Now, here's how they justify it, and it's complete nonsense, but you just understand that, the role of international lawyers is to make it look like agreements mean the opposite of what they actually say. Right? I mean, that's the point of law is being weaponized by international lawyers. And so just as we have international lawyers who can somehow come out, construct some case to invade Iraq, they've got lawyers too who can do exactly the same thing. So what they say is, we have passed laws, Chinese laws, banning other countries' military and intelligence collection activities in our exclusive economic zone. And so you can't come into ours. Now, you haven't done it in yours, so Australia hasn't done it in yours. So we can come into yours. Now, if you choose to pass a law saying that we can't come into your EEZ, no problem. We aren't going to come into your EEZ. But until you do, you're actually saying that we can come in. So what they're trying to do is push the envelope, and play cute, play hypocritical. But as I said, the solution to that is not more threat exchange, and certainly not bringing in lawyers to make it look like that promises are actually don't have to be kept, because the treaty doesn't mean what you think it means. What's needed is meaningful negotiations. But yes, China's activities have been quite hypocritical, and they've justified it using a very kind of technical reading of law, which if we were to pass a law saying, no, you can't do this in our EEZ, they'd probably respect it, but then they'd have one in the sense that they'd have banned the United States from coming into theirs.
It's interesting.
Thanks,
Clinton. Yeah. How does this play out for New Zealand with their no nuclear armed or powered vessels coming into their territory? Have they passed an actual law that, internally that they have to stick to? Because I asked this because there's currently a bit of a controversy going on in New Zealand about Rocket Lab and the potential for Rocket Lab to contravene their nuclear-free status if it was, in fact, engaging in some way or other with, the use of military exchanges. So
no, look, if it's nuclear powered or nuclear armed, then it can't get into New Zealand. But as long as they are activities that are not directly tied to nuclear weapons, then that research can be done. But New Zealand's already passed its laws, yes, and in fact that's why the feeling inside the Australian defence establishment is that they need to be punished for their actions. One of the things that came out in the cables that were leaked, the State Department cables that were leaked and then published on the WikiLeaks website, was that one of the Australian strategists named Michael Petsulo, he actually he was talking to the United States, and he said New Zealand has to pay a negative premium for what they're doing. They've got to pay a negative premium for their anti-nuclear stance, and so that stance is genuine. And if there are nuclear powered ships or powered submarines, then no, they would not be allowed into New Zealand's territorial waters or anything on New Zealand soil. But EEZs is a different matter, because EEZs, the whole law of the sea convention is silent on this question of whether you can do military activities in another country's exclusive economic zone.
That clarifies it. Anything you'd like to add, Lisa? I mean, one of the things that did cross my mind with the strength of feeling in the Pacific about it being a nuclear-free zone, and whether it is, kind of strong enough to actually hold water, that Rarotonga Treaty. But there is a feeling that's been expressed by so many of the Pacific states that they're proud of the ambition to be nuclear free, and how the passage of nuclear armed or powered vessels through those waters of this, I think it's now the Pacific are referring to the blue Pacific continent, because the EEZs are so spread amongst so many small island states. Actually means that there's a vast area that fit into that category.
Yeah, as we talk about this, I mean, the thing that viscerally comes to mind for me is the nuclear threats from the DPRK to our island, right? So, I mean, it's not connected necessarily to the stuff of the sea, but I mean, that's where the rubber really meets the road in terms of nuclear threats, right? So I often share about what happened in our islands and the peak of those threats, because I think that was about 2 summers ago, when the threat specific to Guam, and the backstory to that, of course, is that if the US were to strike North Korea, that the B-2 bombers would be coming from our Andersen Air Force Base. And so hence Guam is, you know, the target for that threat. And so locally here, our government, first of all, says and tried to assure the whole community that there is no real threat because of the missile defense system, and that we would be safe because they have the technology to shoot any missile that would be coming our way before it ever got here. And part of their educational campaign in terms of preparation for such an attack. I'm going into this because this is not just abstractions or, you know, I mean, this is some serious real threats, right? I mean, so serious that, you know, my kid was still in high school. He was a senior in high school. And I literally had to woke up one morning and was like, should I send him to school? Because, I mean, there's an actual date that the detonation was supposed to happen, right? And so our government, of course, in terms of preparation of the community, gave out these advisories, and it included things like, do not use conditioner in your hair because the atomic radiation will stick, you know, and if you can, border your windows, seal your windows and your doors with plastic so that the seepage of the radiation will not come into your home, right? And it's just so ridiculous when you understand the experience of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, right? But I'm going into this, all this is to say is that, you know, these threats are so insanely real, right? And the provocation that happens on both ends. I was part of a group, 30 peace building women globally who went to the DPRK. We were there for 5 days, you know, and hearing their side of the narrative was really interesting. You know, we were at the DMZ line with the 2 UN blue buildings, and we were on the side of North Korea's side, and we heard their stories of provocation, you know, largely by the US DOD, right, who's on the South Korea side of the border. And they were telling us, for example, there was this huge tower, and they were telling us, they said, you know, the US just erected that about 6 months ago without any conversation with that, and, you know, purely for surveillancing purposes, right? It's a huge tower, you could see it has all. So there's a side to every story. And, you know, just as Clinton, you shared, I mean, the provocation. It's okay. It's okay, I unmuted me. But just to say that it's a two-way street, you know, and that the stakes are really high. And we are in the position, in the Pacific, particularly Guam, for example, are the strike zones, you know, and this is geopolitics we have no direct interest in or connection to, right? We're really just these subjects that are caught in these crossfires, and it's—
yeah, that's so true. Yeah, certainly on the strike path as well. The conference that we had in Alice Springs in 2016, a delegation of us went and met with the council in Alice Springs to ask them what their plans were in the event of a strike on Pine Gap. And of course, they had no plans at all in place. So interesting as you talk about that. Clinton?
Yes, I have a question actually for Lisa. And I was wondering, Lisa, how is it that, how we might be able to have a greater communication on a regular basis between organizations in Guam and those in Australia and New Zealand? You know, in particular, you know, is there something productive that could be achieved? Even through an exchange of information or some sort of a regular thing, without wanting to put you under pressure, because you know, it may be that you are called upon incessantly to be the speaker, and you also have your own responsibilities, work, and so on. But what are the organizations, civil society ones, that we can learn about in order to cooperate with you and amplify your voices here?
Yeah, so over the past decade, there's been different waves consistent with the different stages of the NEPA process in terms of the Guam military buildup. So initially there was a group called We Are Guahan, right? It fizzled out. And then we had our Guahan Coalition, which still, I always tell everyone, our coalition just can't die. It just doesn't die. It keeps going everywhere. Oh, we want to invite the Guahan Coalition. But at the end of the day, we're a group of about 20, 30 people. And that is actually bigger than when we first started. When we first started, our group was about 4 or 5 people, right? So we're a group now of about maybe 20, 30 people, different labels of organizations. The most current one now is called Protehi Letexin, Save Retidian, which is an organization of original landowners of the property where Camp Blas, which is where the Marines are being moved to, is being developed. And so that's the latest wave is PLSR. But certainly, I mean, if there's any requests that are made, I oftentimes, you know, I first went out to Australia on an invitation by Hannah to Julian Uggan and myself. Since then, we've had other people as well, you know, participate in I call it an exchange because we share information and what have you. But let's stay in touch. Whatever way, like I was sharing earlier, you know, Richard Tanter just asked me to go see if those satellites have been put up, you know, so, and, you know, recognizing also that our access to information is very limited here because they don't have to consult us and they don't. We found out about the relocation of 8,000, at the time the number was 8,000 Marines from Okinawa to Guahan from mainstream media in Japan. We didn't even know that from our own media or our own leaders, right? So we often, you know, we're really truly in the dark. And for me, that's what has helped to cast light for us, has been connecting with others in the region and figure out what's happening there so we can figure out where we are in the piece of the puzzle, right? So that's been really helpful. But.
Thank you. Well, one good thing, just to conclude my point, is that you know, the Australian government and the United States government are in fact building undersea cables, internet cables, between Guahan and Hawaii, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea. I mean, it's at one level, it should be said that some of these cables are being built using the Australian aid budget. So it's actually foreign aid that's going into building these cables rather than, say, some infrastructure budget and so on. But once these connections are there, of course, they need to be affordable. It might be easier for the so-called Blue Pacific to actually interact in a better way, at least this decade, as they keep strengthening the infrastructure, the communications infrastructure. I mean, for their own purposes, I think it might be possible that, you know, we might have a better chance of cooperating across borders.
Yeah,
thanks.
And, you know, if I can just add that the investment of countries like Australia and New Zealand in the infrastructure has been really helpful. Technology is one of our biggest limitations in terms of connection to each other, and the flight paths. You know, we all, you know, especially for the South Pacific, generally having to go through Australia, the cost of travel for myself, for example, to PNG, which if we had a direct flight would only be about 5 or 6 hours, would normally take me about 2 days to get there, because I'd have to fly to Australia overnight and then go back, right? Even though on the map, you know, PNG is right beneath us. So yeah, those are very colonial kind of structures that exist that separate us, but we do what we can.
Yeah. Julie, last question from Julie, and then we will be winding up after this question. Julie?
Oh, yes, thank you. The question is, I really didn't have a question, but I wanted to say to Lisa that I've been to Rarotonga in about 1985 or 6, and loved it. And I've been in the peace movement since 1981. So we went through the 1984, you know, big marches in our country and that anti-nuclear. I feel more comfortable. I'm sorry for the men in the room, but talking with women like about these issues, and I think there's a great opportunity for women and children with the climate change and the nuclear trouble we find ourselves here in Australia at the moment. I feel I don't feel as I feel less afraid of China than America, because we've just come through that 20-year war and several wars that we've been involved with. And there must have to be a turnaround. There has to be this change. And it's great the men are in it. And yesterday we had this great forum with about 4 young women from the university. and they're looking into the, you know, the sale and export of weapons all over the world.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, so yeah, it's a comment really, not a, but thank you for all that information, and I really do like that new 4-word thing that Clinton was talking about. I've written it down here. What was it again, Clinton, please?
The democratic and equitable international order.
That's it. We're going to put those in our letters now.
Oh, yeah, well, our ambition should be to have it roll off people's tongues as smoothly as rules-based international order.
That's right. We'll work on it. Now,
Thank you.
Lisa, would you like to have any final comments? We've lost Lisa.
Yes, I just wanted to mention, sorry, it's just because can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
My battery's dying, so I have to plug in. So I'm on the general activism that was not around during the NFIP when it was thriving. But every opportunity I get with Nick McClellan to talk, you know, because it really represents a time of such Pacific empowerment. And so there's been talks about different pieces of NFIP kind of coming back to life. And so, you know, there's a way for us to be able to reignite that. And I think certainly with the Pacific Indigenous Women's Network, you know, that's where we're really harnessing our power as women to be able to take a stand in our communities and really create the kinds of communities that we want to see.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Clinton, final comments?
No.
No.
Thank you.
Well, it's been an incredibly interesting and engaging talk and sharing of knowledge from both of you. And I want to thank you on behalf of us all here at this gathering. I'd also like to again reiterate and thank the International Peace Bureau for organising this Congress. And I think we'll all look forward to seeing the recordings of many of the sessions that we weren't able to attend because they've been in the middle of the night, basically, more than anything else. And we'll work on this very hard to bring people together, to keep the communication going and to build this movement, because it's an absolute necessity. We have to build this movement. We're not prepared to go into another war. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming tonight.
Thanks, Annette. Thanks, everyone.